So we have a great panel today. I'm excited because I get to ask all the tough questions. So maybe we'll start with a round of self-introductions for everyone. So I'm Danny Brown-Wolf. I'm the head of partnerships at Orbs, based here in San Francisco.
Hey everyone, Rodolfo Argueta. I work at Salesforce in our product management group, and I know Orbs from a while and big fan of Starfish as well. So hats off to you guys.
Hi everyone, my name is Asha Vellaikal. I run labs for a company called Marsh. It's as old school as you can get. It's a 150-year-old insurance broker, commercial insurance broker. And we pretty much sit in all kinds of business transactions that take place, whether it is insuring this building, insuring the Uber ride you take on, or insuring the Bay Bridge that you rode on. So, and we are looking at blockchain quite intensely.
Hey, my name is Alessandro Voto. I go by Alex. I'm the West Coast Regional Director for Consensus. I've worked with our solutions team who does a lot of enterprise consulting. I was around when the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance was started, which is a big consortium of companies all working to create standards for enterprise use of Ethereum and related technologies. And I also work with a group called Gitcoin, which helps you put bounties on GitHub issues that you want solved to help fund open source contributions.
Awesome. We'll start with an easy one. Feel bad for the panel. So I think there's a lot of talk in the space as someone who's also in the real crypto and blockchain scene about trust and about decentralization. But when you talk to enterprise, you need to bring to the table, okay, how much money are you saving us? What is the commercial value of these solutions? So I would like to ask you if you can each maybe discuss a use case that you believe does give actual commercial value, and maybe throw in a note about, is there even a discussion when you talk to a lot of blockchain companies around commercialization?
So I'll get started. So for Salesforce Trust, this sounds a little cheesy, but trust is our number one value, literally. So everything that we do, we try to start at that level, right? So the discussion of trust is ever present, I would say. So when I think that there's a distinction between decentralization and distributed trust, which is kind of like one of the things that we work on with our customers very closely, right? And that trust itself can generate a lot of value, right? So if you think about the way that companies interact with each other today, you'll see that there's a lot of the friction, right, between companies is because of the lack of trust. Like, I don't know that if I give you X money, you're going to do Y for me, or I don't know how well you're going to be doing that, right? So in our view, and I'll speak specifically about some of my opinions. I'll just preface, will be specific to Salesforce. Some will be my own. This is, as you guys know, kind of like a developing space, right? So when it comes to trust, I would say that all of our use cases are actually, that's kind of like a bedrock of the value being generated, because by increasing those levels of trust is that companies can actually create the true value. So an example of that, specific to your question, is I would say ASU, Arizona State University, is one of the customers that we announced back a few months ago in Trailhead. And what they're doing is they're trying to create a universal learner record, right? So that students don't have to worry about, well, first of all, employers don't have to worry about fake credentials. Students don't have to worry about keeping track of all the courses that they've taken, and they can actually create value by combining some of those credentials into potentially degrees later on. I can get into a little bit more specifics around that. But all that is facilitated by the fact that a number of universities have gotten together, have said, we're going to trust each other. We're going to agree that course A at University A is equivalent to course B at University B. And that level setting allows for this economy of knowledge and credentialing to emerge, right? So I would say that it's not antithetical to think about trust and about enterprise use cases.
So at Marsh, we look at blockchain in two different ways. So the first thing is really the crypto aspect of it. So if you look at the crypto aspect of it, most exchanges that you have heard of, we work with them because they want to insure or risk protect their assets so they can provide it as a trusted thing for their end customers. It's not an easy solution. At the end of the day, we only insure cold storage of their crypto assets. And you will be interested to know that the people actually at the back end who actually insure these crypto assets are the same people who actually insure very high valued art items. So it's really a kind of a dichotomy that something as modern as crypto and something as ancient as really high valued art are being insured by the same people. So there's that aspect. We don't call it enterprise blockchain, but we do have a group that's dedicated to crypto companies who want to insure their assets at the end of the day. But what we talk about in enterprise blockchain is so we have done a couple of use cases on production use cases. The first one, the main one I would like to talk about is proof of insurance. So if you look at in your personal lines, you're probably used to having proof of insurance. If you're driving a car, you need to keep your proof with you at all times that your car and your liability is insured. So in the same ways, if you own a home and if you have a mortgage, you need to have a proof of insurance that there is insurance on your house. So every single business transaction actually requires insurance. So most of the time, any business transactions, any contract will have a paragraph or two about insurance requirements. And most of the time what happens is that some contract happens, their broker will call us up, and we will have to generate a proof of insurance and mail it out, and it's a very archaic process. So we actually do tens of millions of proof of insurance every single year. So that's one of the first business process that we have tackled using blockchain. So we actually have a proof of insurance running on Hyperledger, where all of our big enterprise customers can come to ask for that proof of insurance. We actually log on the blockchain as to who asked for it, for what amount, and who was it sent to, and all of that, so that there's perfect auditability and regulatory aspects of all of that. So that's one example of trust that we give every single business process that happens. We've also worked on other things.
That's an interesting basis for, I don't know if you guys have seen The Laundromat, the new, is it on HBO? A Netflix. So one of the problems that it tackles there in the lack of verification industry is really like secondary and third insurers that are denying their insurance, and something like a proof of insurance would solve that.
Right.
And a lot of the fraud in the space.
Yes. And I think for it to come from a verified, permissioned blockchain that is supported by the big wigs of the industry, provides a lot of trust to a lot of business processes that's out there. We also do things like placement. So typically when an insurance transaction gets placed, it's a very complex process, unfortunately. And at the time when a binding happens, when the policy is set, typically the policy document doesn't come in 2-3 months after that. So there's a lot of ambiguity in the time between the time the binding happens and where the policy is issued. So we are actually trying to solve that problem, because these are millions and hundreds of millions of dollars worth of insurance that goes on with some ambiguity on the exact terms on which it was insured. So more and more we are trying to bring that also onto a blockchain that is supported by all the partners in the industry, that everything is verifiable, all interactions are actually written onto a blockchain, can be auditable, and is shared between all the parties.
Your question was like assuming that trust is a basis of blockchains, like where is the commercial potential for like high value stuff? So like many of us that have been in the blockchain space for quite a while and saw sort of the rise of the enterprises being interested in this stuff, remember like central banking being interested in the fact that you can consolidate everyone's interbank ledgers and reduce the time of clearance from 3 days to 0 or minutes. And that's billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of escrowed funds just in case they mess up and mismanage their ledgers. So if you want to talk about massive commercial situations, that's obviously one of the biggest. We've worked with the Monetary Authority Singapore, banks in South Africa, and some others to actually implement that kind of technology and run it live for real actual transactions. So that's an example of like a huge thing. We've done similar kind of like liquid market activities with real estate, so helping people tokenize real estate assets and shift those a lot quicker, so reducing that friction, which always amounts to a massive commercial opportunity. But for me, what motivates me to work in the space is seeing stuff like what the World Food Program did, where for Syrian refugees living in Jordan, they gave these people an account balance on Ethereum instead of what they used to do, which is way back it was just drop food, which was insensitive and extremely costly from a logistics perspective. Then they moved to cash, but there are tons of intermediaries and like all these cards and prepaid stuff, and that was costly. And they moved it to basically having an Ethereum-based account balance. It wasn't giving them Ether or any cryptocurrency. It was just storing a balance. And these people would go up to their local market where they had choice of what they wanted to buy, and they would put their eye in an iris scanner, which would basically release the funds and sort of sign the account to reduce that amount and credit it, give that basically to the merchant. So when you talk about commercial opportunities, it's not just like the massive amounts we could save for banks, it's also the amount of money that's saved then for providing aid and food for people. That means you're now putting that much more food into people's bellies. Like that's really cool. So when you talk about cost savings, it's not just for the rich, but also for the poor.
That's actually the use case that brought me into blockchain.
Yep. It was the one that got me serious about it.
My
too.
former pre-blockchain life was in foreign policy, and I worked in the Israeli mission in the UN. And one of the biggest problems that we tackle as in the UN community is really how do we make sure that the donations that we give end up to the end user as opposed to 100 intermediates in the way, and specifically in the refugee camps, local mafias that take over the food, in addition to the fact that there is a degree of dignity when you come in and you take something from the supermarket from a credit account as opposed to stand in line for handouts. Yeah, so that's actually, I love it that you mentioned this use case. So Asha, I actually wanted to ask you, we mentioned here, we touched on blockchain, the potential of being a platform play for cooperation. And how much in this space, I mean, the insurance industry in general is being, on the one hand, disrupted by many new players, especially in real estate, insurance, etc. Lemonade, Hippo. There's a lot of external threats, but it always seems like one of those old industries that's having a lot of trouble sharing its data with the world or with its competitors, even if it gives it a better benefit. So for enterprise in general, and maybe you can speak about your industry and you guys can add insights, how much of it is it a platform play and a standardization play that requires really a cooperation? And does the old world enterprises ready for it?
Yeah, so let me tackle the insurtech part of it first. So yeah, definitely. I mean, from someone like me who's in innovation in insurance industry, I mean, I love the insurtechs, because at the end of the day, for all these big behemoth corporations to start changing and to be more, helps to have I always feel like, sometimes in these companies, having these dark clouds on the horizon is really what causes them to innovate. So that being said, I don't think none of the insurtechs has really taken a big bite in the space yet. It's too early. And for us in Marsh, we see it as there are two ways. One is that, see, at the end of the day, we see insurance as an add-on, as a value add, right? So if you have other blockchains that are developing in the space, which are gaining traction, there are actual volumes of transactions and real stuff happening over there, there's invariably need for some insurance or risk management there. So we always feel that, okay, how do we plug in to that ecosystem? So we are very, very agnostic on platforms and technologies and so on. The two examples that I talked about, they have both been done on Hyperledger Fabric. We are members of Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. We are members of B3I. There are two actually big insurance consortia. One is called B3I, one is called RiskBlock. So there are some activities around standardization happening. They are both actually happens to be on R3 Coda. So, I mean, we are not that hung up on exactly which technology platform it is, but we do feel that at the end of the day, whatever it is, we have to have a solution which plugs in and provides risk management. And what does that actually mean? What does that mean to have a whole big trade credit supply chain platform, blockchain? We would like to see more and more actual enterprise blockchains working with real volume of transactions happening. And we would love to see how do we plug in with risk management to that. And it's still, we're kind of early on to see real transactions happening on the enterprise blockchain space.
Yeah, I was just maybe take this a little more philosophical. Like, before I was at Consensus, I worked for a group called the Institute for the Future, which does forecasts for businesses and governmental orgs and nonprofits on the long-term future. And I started researching cooperatives a little bit, which is businesses or organizations that are owned and operated by the people who sort of benefit for them or who work for them, where people have equity and they have governance control. And if you look at Bitcoin, Bitcoin is a form of cooperative that's digitally managed, right? It's like everybody puts in computing power and storage, and they get out the opportunity to get paid with some amount of coin from that. So you actually get out benefit from having contributed this valuable resource of decentralized storage, which is pretty neat. And I think what I've found when talking to enterprises about adopting blockchain technology, what they struggle with is adopting to that mindset of the fact that when you participate in these digital cooperatives, like you have to work with other companies on their own terms. There shouldn't be at least a single owner or anyone who can stop things or modify things. That mind shift and that actually like that IT shift is actually quite difficult. It's a lot of the difficulty of consulting for an organization to make that transition. And if you're an enterprise looking into blockchain and you're not ready for that, which is to say you're not ready to share that platform with others, to spread out the value of that and contribute, chances are you probably actually don't need a blockchain, right? Maybe you need a centralized group or some trusted intermediary or something. So these lend themselves to cooperation. They are best served when everyone's operating on a common infrastructure and it's open to any participants, or at least those that meet the qualifications and stuff. It's really good at being an impersonal, awesome robotic third party that allows for cooperation in new ways.
Yeah, I would just add, to that point. I mean, the whole notion of blockchain, of like that shared IT or like that data that's sitting, your competitors' data sitting in your data center, even if it happens to be encrypted and all that. I mean, it's not easy to get through the legal frameworks and imagine getting your lawyers to agree to something like that, which is, your primary competitor's data sitting in your blockchain. And so there's a lot of education, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to actually even get there.
Perhaps the only contextual thing to add to what you guys were saying, right, is definitely, I mean, there's phases and there's stages, right? I mean, we're like everyone is early on in this space, and everyone is trying to figure out how to I'm going to generalize a little bit, and this is my opinion, kind of like getting to do the things that we've done so far in better ways, right? So I think that's potentially like stage 1, right? But then there's definitely stage 2, stage 3, and other things that are, in my view at least, coming to the enterprise space. And some of them, frankly, have been more advanced in the permissionless space, right? Around, for instance, incentive alignment, right? So what you were talking about, about contracts and legal and all that stuff. In some ways, it's perhaps a little simpler in the permissionless space because it's all managed via currency, right? Versus legal contracts. That being said, the questions around how do you actually operate in this new mindset, to your point, that's decentralized in the sense of not computing, but of decision making and power, right? Definitely that's going to become something really important, at least in my opinion. So the only thing, again, it's just a little bit of context, right? So we're not at the end. We're at the very beginning of the race.
I completely agree. And while we do come to serve clients, at the end of the day, I'm always pushing for, okay, what are the easiest use cases to first implement? And those usually involve the ones that there is no problem with sharing information, like rights management. The idea is that the information is out there and no one has a problem with it. So those, I believe, would be the first ones to be adopted. Rodolfo, I'm going to stick with you for a second here. I'm sure with the brand of Salesforce, and I don't know if you have blockchain on your LinkedIn, that must ruin your inbox. I'm sure you get a lot of startups in the space that a lot of times that's where the real innovation is. Those are the movers or shakers. Those are the ones who are really trying the cutting edge stuff. But in this space and in general, a lot of times the startups don't know really how to work with enterprise. So maybe you can shed some light on how you think we can bridge that and maybe a few prerequisites even for startups in the space.
Yeah, sure. So I do think that we're privileged in a lot of ways because we're able to talk to large companies that have real pain points and they're trying to figure out how potentially a blockchain solution helps, right? And then on the other hand, to your point, we do get to interact with a fair number of startups that have incredible, I would say, intellectual capital, right? Really, really smart people, cryptographers, PhDs, like it's fascinating, right? So we do get to see a little bit of both. Now, specifically to your question around, what are some of the things that would be helpful for startups to engage with enterprises, right? Perhaps this may seem like super basic, but really perhaps understanding a little bit the enterprise space. It doesn't have to be super deep, right? But we've engaged with some companies that we think have interesting technologies. But the reality is that from the get-go, like the core DNA, and nothing wrong with that, right, is permissionless, right? So when we start asking about questions that are very germane to the enterprise space, they really don't have a good answer to those. So if you want to engage with enterprise, I guess step one would be kind of like understand at least what are the top 3 things, right, that are important to enterprises. And I would say is number 1, figure out what the permissioned infrastructure should look like, and there's different archetypes for that. But what is your point of view in terms of a permissioned blockchain? I think would be an interesting thing to thought experiment at least. Secondly, I would say try to really think about the issue that I think you mentioned around, or you mentioned around, like kind of like data, right, living everywhere, right? I don't think that there's like one answer to that question, but how do you control the access to data when you're dealing with, even though it's a permission setting, you have to think that in that permission setting, there's going to be competitors, right, that need to cooperate. So how do you manage for that? So I think that kind of like coming in with a point of view on some of those topics would, as a startup, would give you a lot of credibility in terms of we're ready to engage and we're ready to build with you. And then the other thing is perhaps when you're talking to Marsh, when you talk to Consensus, to Salesforce, right? We're big companies, right? Maybe not so much Consensus, but we're big companies, right? And having flexibility in terms of the terms that you want to try to negotiate or talk about, etc. That's also important because we generally will not rewrite contracts for for all 200,000 customers that we have. So a little bit of flexibility and understanding that it's a big machine that needs to. The more that you can be flexible in that space, I think the better. So those would be my top three. But.
Yeah, I mean, I would that if you're a startup, then look at a bigger company and say, how will that company play in the future ecosystem, right? That comes up. So that's one way. So if we look at Marsh as a company, we are always looking at, okay, what does that mean for all, if that crypto ecosystem were to develop, I'm sure there is a big risk management for that, which is needed if it were, I don't see it getting bigger without necessary insurance and risk management applied to that ecosystem. So we are always looking for interesting companies in that space, for one example. So look at what you have to offer. Look at a bigger company, look at what does that mean for them to play in that upcoming new space. So that's one. The other thing is for us is whenever we have a blockchain, like the proof of insurance blockchain, we are always looking at companies that will actually make that permission blockchain stronger. So for example, in the proof of insurance blockchain, we have actually partnered with a startup called Evident, because they do identity verification for the shared economy. So if you have a gig worker, there has to be some way of verifying the identity of that worker. And there is a startup that specializes in that. And we just plugged them into our proof of insurance network and just made that stronger, and so we can approach more clients. So that there are multiple ways by which you can go to an enterprise, look at what they are doing, what's their value proposition, and so on.
Well, I think one of the most efficient ways to unlock a ton of value from startups that are serving enterprises is just to ask the enterprises to articulate what they need and the best way to interface with them themselves. Let them be the ones to tell you what your solution must plug in this way. It needs to handle these things. It needs to have these compliance factors. And that's basically why the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance was started, is to hear from financial industry groups, real estate groups, telecommunications groups, and have them say, these are the main use cases we care about. These are the structures and architectures that we currently have. And this is what these things must accomplish. So we've actually had use case documents where people have shared these by industry. We've also had some kind of meta level enterprise requirements, which have been codified into the client specification for Ethereum, which all quote enterprise grade Ethereum clients, which actually, by the way, might include Ethereum mainnet for many enterprises, depending on what they're trying to do, what it must achieve for a particular enterprise. And that includes things like new permissioning models, which have been worked on by people who formerly worked at Hyperledger or with IBM through the Hyperledger Foundation, working on like organization level permission models, people working on zero knowledge proof technology that would allow for private transactions that don't leak that enterprise data. And the enterprises are the ones telling us this is what it needs to do. And that's in concert with the providers who say, yes, there is new technology that actually can allow this to happen. So that meeting of the minds and that standardization across all enterprises as a massive community and also by industry really helps us not have to read people's minds or have lengthy discussions. It's like any startup, if you read the docs, which we're good at, by the way, can just figure out how to plug in with an API and actually help serve people on their own terms.
Okay. We spent a lot of time in Asia, and it seems like specifically in enterprise adoption, I mean, they're like 2-3 years ahead. You look at Korea, Samsung is already like whoosh, running with anything blockchain. Korea Telecom has their own blockchain, Kakao. And this is just Korean examples. Why is the United States-based enterprises are a little bit behind? What's the biggest hurdle for adoptions here that I don't know if they exist in Asia or not? Is it a business culture thing with general adoption of very new technologies, or is it something specific to blockchain and a liability aspect?
That's an interesting question. So I would say that, and this is based on just my perhaps superficial knowledge of a little bit more of the B2C kind of like projects, right, in Asia. That's really it, right? It's like from a regulatory perspective, it seems at least, and this is again perhaps a somewhat uninformed opinion, it seems that the regulatory environment is friendlier for the B2C space, and that's what that's one perhaps one of the differences versus the US, where I think that a lot of the things that we're seeing are more around how companies can improve the collaboration that they have with their partners. How can they develop ecosystems? But I would say that perhaps my visibility, at least, is a little bit more limited in that sense. And in that sense, I don't think that there's been a lot of regulation that has been impeding that growth in the B2B space. But perhaps I can let you guys weigh in on that and see if you see an actual difference between B2B, B2C in the different markets.
Yeah, I would add that. Yeah, I agree with your thing. I actually think that it's a good question. Why are we behind in the US? I think it is regulatory risk, one of them. But at the same time, I think in the US, they're becoming very pragmatic. I think the more we can, as I said, the more there are good examples of enterprise blockchains that have real volume, real use cases, real users. I think, and it's known. I think we'll take off. I just think it's just not there yet, or there are it's just at the very early stages. So I think there needs to be more. So I think there's a little bit of skepticism in general. So I think more successful examples, case studies, and I think we will see a lot more adoption.
I'm not entirely sure about the premise that Asia's ahead of us necessarily. We have some awesome clients in Japan, Korea, as you've mentioned. As I was mentioning Singapore before, and like in the Philippines, where we helped rural banks get together and actually be able to facilitate transactions. So like we found that there are a lot of groups that are hungry for this, and in some cases there are regulations that make that a lot easier. But in the US, it's not. I wouldn't say we're behind. I think there are a lot of entrenched players that are looking at the core pieces of what they do and trying to take small strides. So we're working with one of the biggest consumer packaged goods companies in the entire world, and trying to help them gain more visibility into their products and help them explain to the consumer that their products have certain features, like the fact that they might be organic, for example. So these things take time, and there are massive institutions in the U.S. for which the need may be more targeted and more deeply rooted, and might require a lot more kind of like user validation, more discussion in there. Where perhaps the need might be more pressing or urgent, like in the Philippines, for example, where folks are disenfranchised. And there are obviously places where there are sandboxes, regulatory sandboxes that make innovation a lot easier. And we enjoy working with folks through those sorts of things. But I think we're all going at our own pace, and it's different momentum. There are massive institutions everywhere and small groups, and we learn from each of those.
I would also add that when I look at a little bit about some of the reasonably successful enterprise blockchains, like marine cargo or, some very specialized, they are all controlled, unfortunately, by some of the bigger players in the space. And it's not as easy to get into them and get access. It's not like an open ecosystem to get to access to that data and start innovating on top of it.
Seems like a lot of times it's a runner-up strategy, and which makes it harder to be implemented when there's a monopoly in the market.
Yeah, and they treat it as a strategic advantage, and there's too much enterprise inertia, not inertia, but yeah, there are too many impediments, and which is kind of unfortunate. I think I would rather have the bigger enterprise creating some of the enterprise blockchains and then making a more of an open ecosystem around that data.
Okay, so last question for today. Usually in these panels, everyone asks, okay, what's the first use case or what's the first industry that will have blockchain adoption? And everyone answers supply chain and payments. My question is, what would be the last industry, in your opinion, to have mass adoption? I will start. Healthcare, unfortunately. Just because I have my other half does healthcare, and I know how difficult it is to get just normal technology in there. It's like blockchain with all the more regulatory hurdles there are, I feel like the harder it is to get new technology in. So I stole that one from you guys, so you need to quickly get it.
That's interesting. I it's calling out a specific.
People wasting their time on it.
Yeah.
Right now.
Let me think about that. Let me pass the baton for now.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I'm going to take a contrarian approach and say anything which is highly regulated. But for some reason, people seem to think that financial industry is the one where things will immediately, there will be some, things coming up. And I don't think it will come up that easily. I just realize how incredibly regulated some of these industries are. So I would just say that innovation there will come slower in some ways than people expect, but maybe it's a contrarian view.
So like art, I think, is one of these things where people have tried to like tokenize pieces of art. I think that happened quickly, and like in a lot of cases, the experimentation's open there. But I think I don't know, some of those values of I think it's interesting to make things scarce and to support artists and stuff. But I think the real transformation there, like, might take longer. Like it's actually in my mind, it's contradictory. I'm trying to think of the things where the need is less present, and I think art might be one of those. Whereas, like, honestly, in healthcare, we're hearing a ton of this stuff. Even years back, I contributed a white paper for personally owned medical records that was accepted by NIST and the Health and Human Services Department of Health and Human Services for being like feasible for what they thought in use for Medicare re-enrollment. So like there is a hunger for it, and I think the misconception is that if it's highly human laden and bureaucratic and paperwork related, that's the last thing that blockchain will touch. I think that's honestly because of money reasons and time reasons and saving lives reasons. Those are honestly some of the most ripe areas, and those are the ones we're getting a lot of inbound for on that side. Is like anything to do with large bank payments, anything to do with healthcare, because it's regulated, because you need informed consent, for trials, because there's a dire need to share patient data to solve the world's hardest issues. There's a lot of it will be difficult to cross those initial hurdles, but the power of what that unlocks is big enough that I think we'll see that a lot sooner than we will for kind of some smaller fun things, which, like in gaming, we're doing a lot already. It's really exciting, but the transformation there, it's not maybe as necessary.
I love that approach, where the value is.
I mean, it's the money, like we need that to develop it, and it's coming.
Yeah, I mean, not related to blockchain, but like over the last week, there was, the quantum supremacy paper from Google, and there was so much fear, like for whatever it is, there's so much fear that about blockchain and will what's written today, can it be decrypted 20 years from now, and what should people do it? I mean, it was kind of not kind of related to your question, but there is a lot of fear right now in the market about, but so talk about regulated industries and, writing the encrypting stuff, which may be able to be decrypted even 20 years from now. So we are, I think, kind of entering some uncharted territories in that respect.
So I would say perhaps government, actually, because there's no money there, number one. And number two, I mean, there's no like revenue. It's not a revenue generating enterprise. And number two, because it seems that industry kind of like pushes the boundaries, and then government catches up, right? So by that logic, I think that may be the case. The other thought that I had in more on the commercial space was, in any industry that's tending towards being monopolistic, or at least like 2, 3, 4 big companies, right? At the end of the day, the value gets generated in an ecosystem longer term, right? So if there's like, those are huge barriers to entry, if there's like these mega players there. So it would take a lot for the smaller guys to get coordinated. But if that happens, of course, that would be a game changer. But those just two perhaps general thoughts on that.
Maybe airlines.
Well, thank you guys very much. It was a pleasure. Super interesting. Thank you all for being here.